German doctors, who conducted experiments on people monstrous in their cruelty, covered their sadism with the great goals of saving humanity. Killing for pleasure is ugly. Killing to save the soldiers of the German army is a completely different matter. The German executioners, who called themselves doctors, felt quite comfortable watching the death convulsions of distraught people. They wanted to go on and on, inventing more and more tortures for them. One of these sadistic doctors was Dr. Sigmund Rascher, who worked on behalf of Himmler in the Dachau camp. His task was to conduct experiments on humans in order to find ways to increase the endurance and frost resistance of German pilots. At first, Rascher decided to investigate how high atmospheric pressure affects pilots. We do not know whether the Germans were going to send their soldiers into space or were planning something else, but the experiments on people that Rascher began in Dachau in the summer of 1942 were connected precisely with stratospheric flights. A specially designed pressure chamber was delivered to Dachau, where the subjects from among the concentration camp prisoners were placed. A person was locked in a cell, after which air was pumped out from there, creating conditions close to those formed at an altitude of 10 kilometers. After that, the death doctor would settle down near the viewing window and with great attention follow the sufferings endured by the subject. Before you continue watching, please subscribe to my channel and like it. Of course, this is optional. The main thing is to be sincere. Sigmund Rascher periodically changed the conditions of torture. At some point, it seemed interesting to him, in addition to pumping oxygen, to add such a factor as cold. And Dachau developed a unique pressure chamber that was cooled to sub-zero temperatures, simulating atmospheric conditions at an altitude of 30 kilometers above the ground. A sadist in a white coat wanted to find out how long a potential pilot would last if he got not only into conditions of low pressure and lack of oxygen, but also the cold inherent in the upper layers of the atmosphere. As a result of the stratospheric experiments, out of 200 subjects who suffered torture, 80 people died. The rest were killed so that there would be no witnesses. But that was just the beginning. Sigmund Rascher set out to find a way to increase the cold resistance of German soldiers, to discover a recipe for hardening the body, which would make it easy to tolerate frosts. Naturally, for such experiments, he selected those who have a natural tendency to endure the cold. Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians were selected from the prisoners of Dachau. They were considered to be closer genetically to the Aryans, unlike the Eskimos, Evenks, and Chukchi. At the same time, because of the habitat area, they endured the cold more stoutly, so they became guinea pigs for Sigmund Rascher. He decided to conduct his experiments with two parallel tasks. The first is to determine the threshold of tolerance to cold, after which death occurs, and also describe the physiological features of dying from low temperatures. And the second is to find the best way to warm up freezing fighters. To conduct the first part of the experiments, Rascher selected a group of subjects and dressed them in military pilot overalls, equipped with hoods and life jackets. All the subjects were placed in a cold pool with a water temperature from 2 to 12 degrees. The differences in the dive were that some of the subjects were fixed underwater, including the head and neck, and the other part of the prisoner's head and neck were above water. A terrible moan stood over the pool. The soul-rending screams were so terrible that even the Dachau guards asked to move the experiment away or find a way to make the test subjects scream more quietly. Then Rascher came up with the idea of giving the unfortunate ether. This served as a kind of anesthesia. The pain threshold shifted, and people dying of cold were not so painful. The second part of his experiment on thawing freezing only at first glance could seem humane to someone. First freeze, but then warm up the subject and achieve the restoration of vital organs. However, it was an illusion. No one treated the warmed-up people, frostbitten limbs, as well. But the test subjects were not destined to die from gangrene either. They were put to death immediately upon completion of the experiment, so as not to spend money on amputations. No accurate statistics, records of these experiments have been preserved. However, during the investigation of the famous doctor's case in Nuremberg, one of Sigmund Rascher's assistants testified and told how the torture took place in cold water. He said that he had never seen more terrible tortures, especially when two Russians were lowered into the pool, who lasted 2.5 hours in cold water. It was unbearable to see, recalled Walter Neff, an orderly at Rascher. All the staff who watched the experiment began to beg Rascher to stop the torments of these unfortunate people and kill them, but he refused. Sigmund Rascher was literally bursting with a sense of his own importance. It was bursting so much that he even decided to convene a scientific conference in Nuremberg. 95 people who called themselves doctors gathered at this medical forum to listen to reports about torture. Among the speakers was not only Sigmund Rascher himself, but also his colleague, Professor Holzleiner of the University of Kiel. He read a long 30-page report. This report has been preserved and has become evidence of the crimes of the doctors in Nuremberg. When after the war, Holleiner was detained in the case of doctors, and he gave his first testimony, the investigator became absolutely clear that the professor was involved in the experiments of Sigmund Rascher. Out of fear of the inevitable punishment, Holleiner passed away. Death also befell the most important experimenter. By the end of the war, he decided to deceive the leadership of the Third Reich. Sigmund Rascher said that he was close to a brilliant discovery in gynecology, which would allow even elderly women to give birth to healthy children. His 48-year-old wife suddenly gave birth to 3 healthy children in 3 years. Himmler stood waiting. The problem of childlessness was relevant for many. Rascher traveled to various conferences and made scientific reports in which he boldly declared that he was close to a truly revolutionary discovery that could finally solve the issue of maintaining the purity of the race. The barren women of the Third Reich pinned their hopes on Rascher. But suddenly it turned out that Rascher's wife did not give birth to anyone, and all 3 children were taken by him from concentration camp prisoners. The testimony was given by the wife of the head of the concentration camp in Buchenwald, Ilse Koch. After listening to Sigmund Rascher's speeches about a breakthrough in gynecology, she went to Himmler and testified, stating that all 3 of Rascher's children had been taken from Buchenwald prisoners. Himmler could not forgive such impudence, to deceive the Third Reich, and he put Sigmund Rascher in the same concentration camp where he abused prisoners. He was placed in a special bunker for special enemies of the Reich in Dachau. The cheating wife was placed in another concentration camp, Ravensbrück. Both were destroyed at the end of the war, when it was clear that the Reich had only a few days left to exist. During all the time of his experiments on humans, which lasted from 1942 to 1944, Sigmund Rascher conducted 400 tests. Despite the fact that the sadist did not live to see the end of the war, his crimes were thoroughly investigated during the trial of doctors. There is little written evidence of Rascher's crimes. The sadist managed to destroy most of his records. However, there were a lot of witness statements at the Nuremberg trial. The investigation was able to establish that in the period from the summer of 1942 to the spring of 1943, Sigmund Rascher assembled a group of 300 Dachau prisoners. None of them survived. The doctor's experiments after 1943 were conducted outside Dachau. The exact number of victims of the killer doctor during this period could not be established. The dead numbered in the hundreds. Friends, thank you for watching this video to the end. Please make sure that you subscribe to my channel and like this video. Write in the comments about whom to make the next issue.